Welcome into another edition of the Gig'em 247 Sports Podcast. I am Andrew Hattersley. Lucky to be joined by a special guest today, making a return trip to the podcast, Isaac Trotter. Isaac, two completely different years that we've talked about this. We caught up last year with Buzz Williams and 9 seniors on that team. I think it was 8 or 9 seniors, almost the entire roster back. Now, Bucky McMillan, we're sitting in a completely different spot. Appreciate you coming back on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. I mean, no CJ Wilcher to talk about this year. Can't talk about Pharrell Payne anymore and how much I loved him. But yeah, no, completely different roster. Interesting. I think, it's kind of fascinating. I think everybody kind of wanted a little bit of change. And so to have Buzz Williams depart, now you bring in Bucky McMillan. A little bit of an odd hire, I would say, maybe a little bit different. But, man, it's different. And I think sometimes change is good. I'm fascinated to see just kind of how this roster comes together. And to be honest, my first impressions are like this roster's a lot better shape than what I thought when you kind of compared to, you're a late start in the portal. A lot of names are already off the board. For the most part, kind of like the vision of what this roster already looked like, which is kind of promising for the future.
Yeah, you mentioned like just the almost the challenges, and honestly, Bucky McMillan really didn't shy away from it in his intro press conference, talking about, hey, I got your a week or two after the portal opened, and I've got to put together a roster of basically there's one kid there right now and Chris McDermott, and to put together an entire roster for someone who follows the portal as closely as anybody, just could you paint like a picture for those that maybe don't follow as closely, just how big of a challenge that is to be basically a week or two behind the 8 ball and have to build an entire roster to compete in the SEC?
Yeah, I would say it's like running a 400-meter dash and letting everybody start at the 200-meter mark, and you're at the starting gun. Like, it's just different. And I think maybe more than ever before, like a lot of these deals were getting done early. Like for example, Josan Sannon, he hits the transfer portal from Arizona State. He committed to St. John's the next day. Like, that work had been done before. A lot, the agents, the side of this thing, like a lot of that stuff was kind of happening. And the portal window being pushed back this year, combined with, this house settlement where teams are trying to sign guys early so they can get their pay-for-play dollars out before it potentially hits against the cap. If that went through, that kind of forced a lot of teams to really sign guys way faster. And so, guys were hitting the portal already really knowing where they were going, especially with that later window, where, some teams had like 3 weeks off, after their season had ended before the portal window had opened. They weren't technically in the portal, but their agents were shopping them around already. And the coaches were really fired up, or, kind of already knowing where they were headed. So yeah, it's hard when you get a job that late in the process, and a lot of the bigger names are off the board. But, that also does come with a little bit of an opportunity as well, because, some teams can blow their cap space a little bit early in the cycle. You kind of come in at a different time. It's like, all right, like we have opportunity to sell where a lot of other programs don't. So, obviously it's a negative, but I do think there are some little glimmers of positivity that you could look at of having a little bit of like, cap space when other people don't, when certain names, hit free agency.
First name on the board that A&M kind of went after is Jakari Lane. I know we were talking, you have a little bit of familiarity with him, having watched him. What are your impressions of his game, and what can he bring to a backcourt at A&M?
Yeah, well, Bucky's really familiar with him, right? Like, you could argue that Jakari's best game came against Sanford, right? He went for 32 and went absolutely off. The thing, that pops off with him that I first noticed is just how comfortable he is with those pull-up threes. Like, he can really get it going off the bounce. He shot 39% on 117 off the dribble threes. All right, well, why does that matter? I was looking at the data from like the transfer portal class last year. Guys who hit a high volume of those off the dribble threes at the mid-major ranks transferred up and were really successful. Like Chaz Lanier was an example of that, was very, very successful. Even a smaller, undersized guard, who went to Villanova, Jameer Brickus, transfers up from LaSalle, really successful. And the theory is, if you can make those tough shots off the dribble, which is honestly the hardest three to make in basketball, the shots get a little bit easier if you're able to get some more catch and shoots at the next level, or if they maybe play you in some different scenarios. So, that's all encouraging. And you kind of look at the names that were around him, like obviously up to, filter for a level of competition. But you look at the names around him that made off the dribble threes. It's a great list. It's Walter Clayton Jr. It's L.J. Cryer. It's Josh Hubbard from Mississippi State. It's Javon Small, who was an All-American candidate at West Virginia. Like, those are the type of guys that are putting up similar off the dribble three numbers to him. So that's all really, really promising. You know, I think our transfer portal scouting team, I think we gave him a 91, 92, which basically means like we expect him to be a high major rotation player. I think that kind of fits for what they want him to do. And, you know, you just kind of think of the scheme and the buckyball type of era of like getting up and down the floor, transition threes, pressuring the basketball for 94 feet. You can kind of see where Jakari Lane kind of fits into that piece as well. And, you know, I think one question is like, the size. I think a lot of people will definitely have that question. But if you kind of look through the SEC, there's a lot of small guards in this league. Like Jordan Pope, 6'2", Jacoby Gillespie at Tennessee is like 6'1". You know, Michi Johnson is, 6'3"-ish. You know, Xavier Brown, Oklahoma, 6'2". Like, you know, Jakari Lane being 6', 6'1", I don't think is that big of a negative when there's 6'1", 6 foot guys, kind of littered all across this league.
You look at Marcus Hill, right, and he's kind of fits. I know he's listed at 6'4" in his bio at NC State, and Bowling Green listed him at 6'4". Might be a little under that. Might be generous, but you look at his fit, and some might look at it initially and say, well, hang on a moment, like I think he's a 22% 3-point shooter, but I think there's some other parts of his game that really fit what Bucky McMillan wants to do. Just curious how you think he fits into this system and kind of what he brings to the table in terms of his game.
Yeah, I think situation is just everything for transfers, and I don't think he picked a good situation last year at NC State, and the numbers kind of bared it out. I think this situation makes a lot more sense for him because, you know, we talk a lot about like, you got to shoot threes for Bucky, but like rim pressure is so important. And you look at Marcus Hill, 57% of his shots last year came at the rim. So like he looks a little bit different than some of these other guards. Like Lane can really fill it up from three. Ryland Griffin, we'll get to him later, can shoot it from three at a high level. Mackenzie Mbaka can shoot it from three at a high level. They needed that guard who can get 2 feet to the paint, put pressure on the basket. And I think that's where Marcus Hill like looks different. And when I look at roster building, I'm looking at like positional, overlap. You don't want to have guys that do the same things well. Marcus Hill and Jakari Lane do completely opposite things well. And so I think that is like a little bit of reason for optimism on why that fit could work for him. And, I don't think they're bringing him in to be their best player. I don't think he could be, I think he's probably their third or fourth best player, if everything goes right. But I think his role for this team checks off a lot of boxes. And I think Bucky can help him as well, too. Like, last year at NC State, their bigs, they didn't really have any bigs that could stretch the floor at all. Like, I think he's going to be able to get to the free throw line a little bit more. I think he can play off 2 feet a little bit better. And, if you watch Samford at all, like as you're kind of, trying to figure out what Texas A&M could look like, they like to post their guards up at times as well. And that's an underrated part about Marcus Hill's game that I think they could use for him as well, as like a little bit of a booty ball threat. So, yeah, he's a cool fit because he checks off boxes that the other guys didn't have. And I think that's promising. And especially, when you're also talking about a veteran, like it helps to have a 22, 23-year-old that's played a lot of college basketball coming into your program.
100%. You mentioned in there Mackenzie Mbaka, and I feel like that was kind of one of those like early momentum type of deals for Bucky McMillan to kind of send a message to the fan base about what he could do as a recruiter. And you beat out some high level programs, Ole Miss, NC State, many others. Just curious what you think about his game and obviously a former 5-star, but just what he's shown so far in college and what he could bring to Texas A&M.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat myself, but I really do think situation is everything for a guy like this. And the situation he was at Indiana was not very good. They played him at the 3, and you're surrounded by Malik Renew, who isn't a floor spacing 4, and Umar Ballo at the 5, who doesn't shoot threes at all. He barely takes shots outside of 10 feet. That's not Mackenzie Mbaka's best situation. Like he was kind of forced to kind of figure out what my job is. And, he was great in transition, but sometimes Indiana didn't run as much. The paint was always clogged with 2 other opposing big men. He's like kind of floating around the 3-point line. The shooting around at that team was just like non-existent at times, especially when they also threw in Miles Rice, their point guard, who didn't shoot it. So now you look at Texas A&M, it's like, all right, our point guard's a big-time shooter. Our wing's a big-time shooter. and Mackenzie Mbaka can now play the 4, where I think is his best position as a small ball 4. It's nice. It's nice. You kind of, I think they're going to play with more pace. That helps his game a lot. Like I think this scheme is more advanced compared to what Indiana was running. I think this could be a really good spot for him. I think there's some people who have given up on him as an NBA guy, and I understand that. But like, he has a chance to renovate his career a little bit here and really get himself back on track. And I think the scheme here, the opportunity, the position he's going to get to play for A&M, I think it just fits his game a lot more than Indiana. So I'm excited to see kind of what he does with the opportunity, because on paper, this makes a lot more sense for him.
Yeah, what are some of those areas? Like, I feel like, he coming to Texas A&M is an opportunity for him to really be a focal piece. What are some of those areas you feel like he needs to maybe show to be an NBA level player, and that when he comes to Texas A&M?
Yeah, for sure. I think he's got times where he can be a really, really terrific isolation scorer with those mid-post back downs. And then you see him like hit those tough fadeaways from 17 feet. Then you see him hit some of those catch and shoot threes, and out in transition, he can Euro step his way to the rim for layups, and it all looks good. But like, he's got to really sharpen up his handle. I think his decision-making is something that the staff at Texas A&M is going to try to really work with him on to be a better decision maker. I think he just has to pick his spots a little bit better. I think there's times where he can be a really good, like, attacking straight line drives things, but that just never really coalesced in Indiana. There wasn't the space for that, and he stagnated with his development. He didn't get better, like a lot of people thought. Sam Vecini from The Athletic is somebody I really respect in the NBA draft world. Heading into last year, they had him as a potential top 20 pick. So that's like the type of talent that you could potentially see if he could really sharpen up some of those decision making and kind of figure out, hey, what do I do best, and how can I succeed? Because I think the best way for him to get to the NBA is to show that he can be a big time shot maker, especially at 6'9" and 220. I think the quality of threes and the space that he'll play with at Texas A&M, and the obviously more transition threes, I think he could be a candidate to see his efficiency spike. And so like that's kind of what the next step for him. And if he can make that happen, especially defensively as well, he's obviously got to prove himself on that end. But I just think him guarding 4s makes way more sense to me than chasing around 3s like he was asked to do in Indiana.
No doubt, no doubt. We're talking with Isaac Trotter, and national basketball analyst for 247 Sports, and our transfer portal guru. If you're listening to this on the podcast, we're going to take a quick break. If you're on video, hang with us. We'll be right back after a quick break. All right, Isaac, got to dive into the next big name on the list, and it was certainly a big one last week. Ryland Griffin, former Kansas and Alabama standout, obviously was a key member of that Alabama Final Four team. Had a rough year at Kansas. Just what do you think about this fit with Texas A&M and getting another crack in the SEC?
Yeah, and this is a huge get for them. I think a lot of people thought that he was going to go back to Indiana to Alabama. And so for him to head to Texas A&M, again, I like the idea of what they want to be. And you kind of start to see, like, Bucky, he wants to shoot a lot of threes. There's a world where, Ryland Griffin might not lead the SEC in threes next year, but could he make 70+ threes? We've seen that. Like, he could absolutely do that. And he went from an Alabama offense that's maybe more NBA based and is pace and space to Kansas, where it's a lot more set oriented. And it's like, he struggled to pick up those schemes. And I wonder if heading back to Texas A&M under this new offensive scheme, where it is more pace and space, can start to unlock his freedom a little bit. So, big time shooter. He's 6'6", 190 pounds. I think at times he has shown he can be a very good defender, especially on the ball. Especially during that Alabama run to the Final Four, he had real moments where he was very good defensively. I think tapping into that is going to be important. I think playing with the ball in his hands is something that Texas A&M might try to do a little bit more. Kansas really didn't trust him to do that. Like, they really didn't. But at Alabama, he had times where he could run pick and rolls. He could, if the defender went under the screen, he was stepping back and popping those threes. So I think they can play a little bit more the style that he wants to play. And like, you kind of go down the list. It's like Jakari Lane makes a really good decision for basketball reasons. Marcus Hill makes a really good decision here for basketball reasons. You can see why the staff likes him, why he likes the staff. Mackenzie Mbaka, same deal. And I feel the same way about Griffin. It's like, I'm not looking at Texas A&M and being like, wow, like this team's obviously going to win the SEC. But the
Yeah,
process of putting this group together makes a lot of sense. And I think Ryland really encompasses that as well.
no doubt. Because you look at, I think a lot of people kind of looked at this season as, okay, Buzz Williams leaves, virtually the entire roster leaves. This is going to be a rebuild year. Do you see this right now? They've got more work to do. Obviously, still got a couple more spots to fill. Where do you think they kind of stack up in the SEC right now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm still kind of working through that because there's so many big
Yeah,
names with the portal and the NBA draft decisions that have to decide. Like
yeah,
if a Darian Williams comes to the SEC, that could change things. If RJ Luis comes back to school, if Jameer Watkins, stuff like that. But like this group is old. Right? I think right now they have their projected starting lineup, 4 seniors in that, a bunch of fifth-year seniors. Like that really helps. I wouldn't think if they fill this out the right way, like could they compete for a tournament spot? I think that makes sense. Are you an 8-9
yeah,
seed in the SEC tournament, competing for an SEC, competing for an at-large bid? I think that could make sense if some of the depth pieces start to work out here. Because on paper, this group does make sense, but the depth questions are certainly a concern, especially in SEC that's
yeah,
extremely, extremely loaded with that high-end talent. But again, I think we're coming off a year in the SEC that was one of the best in the league's history.
yeah,
The talent level will come down, and part of that is the fifth-year seniors being gone, right? Like just naturally, like we're not going to have like the Janai Brooms who's in college now, like that.
yeah,
This past group of seniors, like there's 4-year guys now that didn't get that fifth-year of eligibility, like a Walter Clayton Jr. or like they mean stuff like that. Or no, Janai Broom. I think Walter Clayton was a true fourth-year senior. But yeah, like Florida's not getting a Walter Clayton Jr. back. My point is, I think the SEC talent level will come down just a little bit. So maybe you have to recalibrate like what type of rosters is actually a good roster compared to last year when it felt like, man, like Auburn just loaded, Alabama's just like loaded, Tennessee's just loaded with dudes. This year, I think the rosters are going to come down a little bit where it's like, man, we got to readjust what's a good team in this league. And I think Texas A&M is certainly in that mix of like, okay, like, if this works and if McMillan works and if Griffin works, like you could see a
yeah,
case where Texas A&M is a tournament team. And you're right, like there is no such thing as a long rebuild anymore in college basketball. It's retool.
yeah.
It's
Right.
retools. Year in and year out. It's a 1-year plan. It's retools. And I think this group on paper so far, it's a pretty good base to have a decently successful first year.
No doubt. Last year's SEC slate was just a gauntlet every week that you kind of went through, and
Yeah.
it was nuts. Got to ask you about this front court because it's kind of I mentioned this in a breakdown I did uh, earlier this week that under Buzz Williams they love these like 6'7" to 6'9" forwards and centers, and now you look at what Bucky McMillan's trying to do. Fede Federico, Zach Clemens, and Jamie Vincent kind of make up that group right now with Mbaka. Just curious what you think about Fede Federico and what he could bring, and then Jamie Vincent and Zach Clemens as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting group. I feel like it's more traditional, right? Like it's more of
Yeah,
like a traditional what a 5-man, lineup would type of look like. Because, Federico, Texas Tech's defense last year with him on the floor against top 100 teams was 12 points per 100 possessions better. Like he is a legit terrific defensive type of piece. And I think he is going to be a guy that can play multiple ball screen coverages. I'm curious to see what Bucky McMillan settles into. Like they were a lot of like really hyper pressure at Stanford. I think he
yeah,
wants to do that at Texas A&M, but I don't know. I don't know if he absolutely can at all times in the SEC. And I think if they play maybe more of a passive defense, that's where Federico could come in because he can play drop coverage. I think he can be a solid rim protector. Again, Texas Tech's defense at the rim was far better with him on the floor compared to when he was sitting. So, he's not a guy that's going to be somebody that I think you throw the ball to on the block like a Zach Edey or a Janai Broom and stuff like that, have him go to work and post ups. But he can be a lob threat, and he is an offensive rebound machine, just like all over the glass. And I think those second chance opportunities is going to be where he really provides value to this front court. So I think he's a high major starting center. I really do. And that's kind of what they're bringing him into. And if you watch Texas Tech during the tournament, they do not pull off that awesome comeback against Arkansas without Federico, like or Fede Federico. I can't ever really know what his first name is. He goes by both.
right.
But yeah,
We were talking about that before. This is what's
yeah.
right.
He had 7 offensive rebounds though in that game against Arkansas. Just like totally saved Texas Tech in that second half. So Yeah, I think he's probably a guy that they're bringing in to start and play 25, 28, 29 minutes a game. The backups, there are real questions there. Like Zach Clements from Kansas, there are a couple years ago where people were like, "Man, Zach Clements shooting cover off the ball in preseason workouts." Like, "Hey, Zach Clements, like keep an eye on this guy. Like, you better be careful. Like, he might be a piece for us." So we'll see. I think he could give them a little bit of floor spacing
Yeah.
as a backup four man. Maybe he can play some small ball five. I don't love him defensively as a small ball five, but it's an option, right? You're kind of wanting to have flexibility. Jamie Vincent, high major frame for sure. 6'11", 225, 230 pounds. I think he needs to pack on a little bit more weight, but he kind of walks off the bus and looks like an SEC big, right? Like, so I
Yeah.
think player development there will be huge. But again, I don't think you're bringing Vincent and Clements in to be, guys that you play more than 15 minutes a game. I think Mbaka is a guy that's going to be on the floor for 33, 34 minutes. Federico, I think he's at least a 25 plus minute guy. And then you're kind of asking Clements and Vincent to just kind of round out your rotation. And if they earn more minutes, that's probably a good thing for Texas A&M long term.
No doubt. We'll close out on this because I think it kind of goes nicely off that point you were just making. When A&M kind of looks at remaining needs, right, with roughly 4 spots remaining on their roster, do you think kind of the front court and wing are kind of the 2 spots you look at this roster and say, yeah, those are the 2 I feel like they still need to address? Or what remaining kind of questions do you have about the roster?
Yeah, for sure. I think technically you have 5 open spots because
Yeah.
the rosters have shifted 15. Most coaches at the high major ranks aren't doing that. They're mostly around like 12 or 13, fill out with walk-ons, obviously. I think wing depth is certainly important. I think another physical wing would probably be something because, like, you look at Ryland Griffin, he can be a little thin. You look at Mackenzie Mbaka, it's like, all right, like when his motor's not revving, like what are you giving us on the glass? So like maybe like kind of like a hard playing 3-4 combo that could really buff up your effort on the glass. I feel like I'm describing someone that Buzz Williams had like 9 of those type of players over the
Yeah.
last few years.
Like an
That's the
Anderson
type of
Garcia.
Anderson Garcia would be perfect. Solomon Washington, something like that. Yeah, like that would
Yeah.
be a type of the roster fit. I think maybe one more guard would certainly help as well. We'll see what Jeremiah Green can do. We'll see what Josh Holloway can do as he transfers up to the high major ranks. But maybe one more guard too to potentially add to this mix. But again, it's slim pickings right now in the portal, so you kind of have to be curious. I'd be curious to see kind of I don't know the numbers exactly, but Mbaka is a pretty expensive addition. Griffin was not cheap to get him. Federico bigs like in this market we're not cheap as well. I'd be curious to see just like how much room in the cap room like Texas A&M could have for one of those
Yeah.
NBA draft guys that comes out, and could they potentially try to be in the mix for him to upgrade over Marcus Hill? Because like, hey, we like Marcus Hill, but I'd love him as my 6th man off the bench, maybe not my starting 2
Right.
guard. So I'd be curious to see if that could happen as well, because they could easily be in the market for a wing, and Ryland Griffin like, hey, we're going to move you from the 3 to the 2. That could work as well.
No doubt. Yeah. Duke Miles, they feels like they kind of had that piece, and obviously he chooses to go
Absolutely.
elsewhere. And so that was certainly a blow. Isaac, great stuff. Thanks so much for joining us. I know I'm sure you're ready for Portal Madness to kind of wind down a little bit, and we appreciate you taking a few minutes.
Of course. Thanks for having me.